unmute yourself. Yep.
Start. Okay, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, where you are. Welcome to our weekly webinar. My name is Tolu Adeoshun, and I am the host for today's webinar. I am also an Assistant Secretary of Voice of Men 360. And just a little bit more about me, I'm a registered social worker, and it's my great pleasure to host today's weekly webinar. Thank you, Voice of Men 360 and the team for giving me this opportunity. We do have weekly webinars with Voice of Men, and we bring experts from different fields to discuss on particular topics. And our whole goal is to create awareness by sharing valuable information with our community. We believe it'll be useful in some ways. Before I introduce our special guest today, I want to give you a brief introduction about Voice of Men. Voice of Men 360 is a nonprofit organization founded in 2020 and is based in Toronto, Canada. Voice of Men 360 was born out of seeing the tremendous needs of boys and men and so our the owner, Sivam, he stepped up to support and help many in areas of their lives. So we are part of International Men's Day, which is a global organization. International Men's Days follows 6 pillars, overall the well-being of boys and men. And it's been serving for over 21 years in nearly 90 countries around the world. And it's joined together by doing various activities regularly. So Voice of Men 360 has been birthed out of this passion by the founder, the president, Sivam, and then we've now gained a lot of followers on Facebook, and we've been doing a lot of programming. So this is one of them. So today's topic for our webinar is Boys and Young Men at Risk, Help Stop Human Trafficking. And our special guest will be discussing on the prevalence of human trafficking in the Greater Toronto Area, the gender stereotypes impacting how we identify and intervene with survivors, as well as how we see the problem of human trafficking, the challenges associated with supporting male victims, the lack of services, the lack of education, and she will discuss further on this, the challenges with accurately capturing the impact of human trafficking and sexual violence on men, and how victimization is exacerbated for individuals from marginalized groups such as the LGBTQ2+, First Nations, and people of color. So our special guest today is actually a former colleague of mine and a friend, and I am so pleased to welcome her. Her name is Krista Macneil. She is also a registered social worker with a Master's of Social Work from Laurier University and is the current Clinical Director of Victim Services of Durham Region, where she co-manages the Anti-Human Trafficking Program and Crisis Intervention Team. With almost 20 years of experience in the field, she has worked in multiple settings, including emergency departments, children's mental health, inpatient psychiatry, and child protection, schools, and in the home care sector. Krista is married with 2 young daughters and resides and works in Durham Region. As a First Nations woman from Newfoundland, she's a strong advocate of anti-oppressive, anti-racist, and trauma-informed practice. She is a longstanding volunteer in various community settings and the recipient of the Distinguished Catholic Volunteer Award for 2019. As a member of the Violence Prevention Council and Anti-Human Trafficking Coalition, she tirelessly works to improve access to services, particularly for individuals who face additional challenges as a result of systemic discrimination. So let's welcome our guest, Krista Macneil. Thank you for joining us today, Krista.
Thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So let me just take you back to your childhood so we can just understand a little bit more. I know I kind of gave a brief summary of your history, but if you could just tell us a little bit more about you, please, Krista.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm originally from Newfoundland, grew up there and left essentially for post-secondary education. So I am First Nation, but I think it's important to acknowledge that despite some of the discrimination that I have experienced, it was largely in terms of like microaggressions and quite minor compared to, I think, what most visible minorities experience. As you can see, I'm white passing. And so I do think it's important to acknowledge that a great deal of privilege went along with that. And that has helped me to get where I am today. I have a very loving family, two parents who were incredibly supportive. And from a very young age, my parents instilled in me a strong moral compass. And so, you know, treat others as you would expect to be treated. And I think that has largely led me to where I am as I, you know, was developing in terms of like my formal education. The more and more social injustice that I saw, the more and more I wanted to be involved to make it right. So I'm a strong advocate for, you know, equity, diversity, inclusion.
Well, thank you so much, Krista. And, you know, I think it's really important that you acknowledge that even though you are First Nations, you are white passing. And so therefore the privilege that comes with that. But thank you for also acknowledging that even though you are white passing, there's still a lot of microaggressions you experience because you are a First Nations woman. So we do appreciate you sharing a little bit more about that. Is there anything about your childhood that you found to be remarkable or you would like to touch on?
Great question. Honestly, I had a great childhood, and I think that, you know, like, I think that's very telling in and of itself, right? That like there's a lot of people out there who can't say that. And so I think that has largely led me to where I am today and the successes that I've had.
Okay. And you did mention that, you know, your parents were great and that they were really supportive. And so, but the only reason you left Newfoundland was to pursue higher education. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, for anyone living in Canada, I don't think it's been a secret that employment rates in Newfoundland are a struggle. There's not a lot of work there. And so both my husband and I, being from that area, as we were progressing in our careers and going to school, you know, the opportunities just weren't there for us. And so we had to go where the opportunity was. Which was, I mean, that was challenging. If you know anybody from Newfoundland, you know that there's a huge sense of pride there, and definitely a massive cultural change leaving the province.
I can only imagine. So for those of you that know, I grew up in the East Coast as well. So I grew up in New Brunswick. It's definitely, I don't feel like it's as isolated as maybe Newfoundland is, but I definitely know that there was a cultural change when I moved to Ontario myself. So let's talk about it. You're talking about finding opportunities to work and all these things. And I feel like that's a lot of reasons why maybe people get involved in human trafficking. So can you tell us why human trafficking is such a large problem?
For sure. Well, I mean, it's a global problem. We know it's a huge problem in Canada, but in terms of how that compares to the rest of the world, we're certainly on the lower end in terms of cases. I mean, it's a multi-billion-dollar a year industry, highly lucrative. So the risk is relatively low compared to the potential payout. It's also largely a hidden crime. And so a lot of victims, survivors are afraid to come forward. They don't come forward. A lot of countries lack legislation in terms of prosecuting traffickers. I mean, I think the rough estimate, and again, it varies depending on the source that you look at, but one of the statistics I've heard is that there's about 4 million people trafficked worldwide, with about 1 million of those being children. And with, of course, the problem being largely hidden and stats not being able to accurately capture the numbers, it's much bigger than what we're even aware of. And then the obvious reason is the breach of human rights, the impact that it has on the survivors and their families and our communities as a whole. It's not the same as somebody who's experienced a single trauma. A single trauma can be enough to you know, completely impact a person's entire life. Victims of human trafficking are almost always subjected to multiple traumas that are just compounding over time. And that complex trauma can be devastating on how an individual functions.
Thank you so much, Krista, for shedding more light. And you know, human trafficking has actually been an interest of mine for years. about 11 years ago when I was doing my master's research, I actually wrote it on human trafficking, but I focused on it in Nigeria. So it's kind of nice how we come full circle. Both you and I are social workers, and it's something that I was passionate about back in the day. And then it's something that you're working on and we're having this discussion about today. So I really do appreciate you coming here and sharing a lot of your expertise with us on this subject matter. So how would you know or suspect that someone is being trafficked?
It's a great question. So, I mean, it varies depending on the type of trafficking, the location, you know, signs and symptoms that you would look for in a survivor, for example, in an emergency department in Canada may look very, very different than what you may look for in a labor trafficking situation in another province or even in another country. In Canada, if I'm thinking of, you know, the individuals that I've worked with, a lot of times they are hungry, they're exhausted, housing may be an issue. So they could either be homeless or a person that moves around frequently. They could have branding or tattoos, which is sort of a form of, you know, a trafficker kind of marking their territory, so to speak. They might be evasive with questioning or vague. They might lack, you know, appropriate hygiene or healthcare, dental care, history of physical, sexual assaults. Often they may be accompanied by a trafficker. So if they're allowed to seek medical attention, there might be a person with them who's not allowing them to speak. For our youth in particular, we have youth that are trafficked, you know, from they're living at home with their parents, they're going to school and they leave school and they're trafficked on their lunch break. So sometimes it's not even, you know, the typical signs and symptoms you would look for. In youth, we look for, you know, grade slipping, change in behavior. Sometimes in the early stages of luring and grooming a victim, you might see that they're wearing expensive clothing or they have items that they didn't have prior to. So, I mean, it really can change depending on the type of situation, but those are some of the typical things that we look for.
Wow, that's really, it's quite scary when you think about it. Just even think, that's something that's never even crossed my mind, that someone could still be living at home. Because oftentimes when I think about human trafficking, it's that they've left home, they're being trafficked, but you're telling me they could still be living at home and they're being trafficked right under their parents' noses. This is a very eye-opening realization. And I'm really glad that you touched on that. Thank you so much, Krista, for shedding some light on that. Thank you. So I have another question for you. Can you explain the difference between human trafficking and sex work? Because I think you were alluding to that a little bit with the lunchtime thing.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, human trafficking in general, kind of the broader term, it essentially means the like harboring, transporting, recruiting, exercising control over a person for the purposes of exploiting them. And that exploitation can be sexual exploitation. It could be, you know, forced labor or labor exploitation. In Canada, what we mostly see is domestic sex trafficking. So about 93% of the human trafficking that we see in Canada is sex trafficking. And that's the bulk of the work that I do. In terms of like sex work versus human trafficking, sex work, it involves an element of consent. And so a person, you know, chooses to enter the sex trade or you know, maybe in the sex trade as a result of their circumstances. Essentially, we refer to it as circumstantial sex work or survival sex work. So they're doing the work as a means of survival, but there's nobody in particular controlling their actions and exploiting them and taking the profit from their work. That's the difference between sex work versus human trafficking. Human trafficking has to involve an element of force, fraud, or coercion.
Okay, so what I'm understanding is that sex work, if you're engaging in it, oftentimes it's voluntary. But when it's human trafficking, there's force is usually included in it, coercion is usually included in it. And so that's how you can differentiate between the two. I was going to ask you next about what it looks like in the Canadian context, but you did touch on that. You said a lot of what we see in Canada is human trafficking in the form of sex work, but it's still not the same thing. So, thank you for answering that question for me. And can you tell me a bit more about the numbers we see in men, because men and boys, because this is what, our platform is about, the issues that face men and boys. And I do believe human trafficking, we don't probably often realize it does affect men and boys too.
Of course, and I think that's a huge misconception, especially in Canada, because the numbers of survivors that we see tend to be mostly female. And so I think a lot of professionals will kind of make that generalization that, like, it doesn't happen to men or the numbers are low. I mean, if you look at it comparably, there are countries in the world where the majority of victims are men. And there's other countries where the majority of perpetrators and traffickers are female. And so, in Canada, we do see that the percentage of trafficking victims is about 95 to 97% female. However, we also know that there are huge concerns with underreporting, both with females and with men, but particularly with men. Because men are a lot less likely to come forward to disclose incidents of victimization, particularly sexual victimization.
Mm-hmm.
We do also see, a portion of labor trafficking in Canada, and men are more likely to be trafficked for labor, particularly migrant workers. We see they're at an increased vulnerability for a number of reasons. They don't have a permanent status in Canada. There could be language barriers, social factors, right, that put them at higher risk. Temporary foreign workers are often brought in, and even their living arrangement is dependent on their employer. And so if they're being taken advantage of by their employer, they risk their living arrangements, their access to food, those kinds of things if they come forward. And so, I think in Canada, we have a tendency to see it more as a female problem. And I think the numbers kind of reinforce those stereotypes and those generalizations. But if you look at it globally, I believe the number for females is 70% to 30% men. 30% of 4 million people is an awful lot of men impacted by human trafficking.
Yeah. So what we're hearing, what I heard from you mostly is that a lot of times it's labor in Canada, that human trafficking, men are involved in human trafficking. There can be some sex work as well. But also you're saying globally, the numbers are bigger, and about 30% of the 4 million you said that we know of, the numbers that we are aware of and that's being tracked, are men victims. And then there's a lot of times that men are also the perpetrators, but in some countries it's the females that are perpetrators, right?
For sure. In Canada, we see about 81% of the perpetrators are male. However, there's other countries, I believe around the Armenian border, we have some countries in there where perpetrators are 86% female.
Wow. So, I thank you so much, because this is just, it's depressing things to hear and talk about, but it's really important we talk about it and we face this issue head on, and just to know what type of things that are out there that we may be unaware of, and we may be naive to. So thank you so much, Krista. I just want to ask you, you're based in the Durham region, right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay, so that Durham region, for those that may not know, is part of the Greater Toronto Area. It's east of Toronto. And so in our region, because I'm actually part of Durham region as well, how prevalent would you say human trafficking is, and how many victims do you guys support a year in your organization?
So I think, again, I just want to highlight the numbers that we give, we know are just the tip of the iceberg. It's nowhere near what we anticipate the true numbers are. So I think that's really important to keep in mind. And some information I can share that kind of sheds light on that and emphasizes that is when we look at our national statistics. The statistics we're using right now is from Stats Canada or from the Public Safety Commission. And essentially what they did was they tracked police reported numbers between 2009 and 2016. We know that police reported cases in Canada are about 1,700 since 2009. So that's a large period of time to say 1,700 victims. In Durham region, just our agency alone, we supported 260 survivors in 2020. And so if you look at that number compared to the national average of police reported cases, that's very telling. But like, we know that if in Durham region alone, we're supporting 260, 1,700 is not going to be accurate in terms of the true amount of numbers that we're seeing in Canada. Those are just the police reported cases. And we all know that, you know, victims or survivors are, you know, often distrustful of police, right? You know, even when they're disclosing or seeking help, it's to service provider organizations that are not the police. So I think that's important to recognize. The GTA is particularly vulnerable when it comes to trafficking. We have about 68% of Canadian human trafficking cases occur in the GTA, or in Ontario, sorry. The GTA is about 25% of the national cases. So Ontario is definitely, unfortunately, has the highest number of any province.
What would you say is the reason for that?
Great question. I think in terms of the 401 corridor, I know our partners in working a lot with the police have said that that is a significant issue, because the 401 corridor borders so many different urban centers that it makes it so much easier for traffickers to move their victims to avoid detection. And of course, we do see trafficking happening more in urban centers like Toronto, Ottawa, Halifax. Also, in terms of the labor trafficking, Ontario and Alberta do see higher influx of migrant workers and temporary foreign workers, particularly to work in areas like agriculture, construction. So again, that increases the risk and the opportunity for traffickers.
Okay, well, thank you for shedding more light on that. So as you know, Voice of Men 360 is about issues that men face, and we did touch a bit on this earlier. Can you just tell me more about how human trafficking impacts men?
For sure. Well, I mean, I think the obvious is, you know, the breach of human rights and the impact it has on an individual and their family and community in terms of, you know, the psychological trauma, increased mental health, substance abuse, those kinds of things. Also, I do think that the gender stereotypes that exist, it really does impact how we identify and intervene with survivors, particularly males. And I say that with reference to the Canadian situation, because of the statistics in Canada saying that, you know, it's 97% female. I think that service providers are less likely to identify cases of a male survivor. We're looking at it as largely a female problem, and so we're missing the boat in terms of intervening with males. I also think that traditional gender stereotypes or things like toxic masculinity really impact the willingness of men to come forward. They're less likely to disclose. They're less likely to talk about, you know, their emotions and their feelings because of these stereotypes of, you know, you don't want to be seen as weak, right? Or the generalizations that are made in terms of, you know, men can't be victims, or men can't be raped, men can't be, you know, victims of sexual violence, those kinds of things. And again, in terms of the, you know, the labor trafficking, you know, a large part of the Western Hemisphere, we put this pressure on men that, like, they are the breadwinners, right? And so when they're in a situation of forced labor or labor exploitation, that pressure is on them to provide for their families, and it does make them more vulnerable and you know, less inclined to seek help because they almost feel that pressure and that responsibility to provide for their families.
So, you know, some of the questions I had next was about gender stereotypes and challenges that community organizations, but I think you pretty much addressed that. You talked about how we wouldn't know to look for it because stats tell us that it's mostly female, that a lot of, because of toxic masculinity, then men feel like they don't, and boys feel like they shouldn't be weak and they shouldn't really talk about these things. And then the pressure that you said, the pressure to provide and to be a provider in the family, therefore it makes the person feel like, well, I'm just going to suck this up and do it. So I, thank you for just, really opening our eyes. And so how will someone recognize if a male or a boy, a man is being trafficked though?
Largely, it's a lot of the same indicators. Yeah. I mean, sometimes the situation can vary dependent on the person. But again, I think it's important to acknowledge that like men are not as forthcoming when it comes to incidents of victimization. But a lot of them can be just as vulnerable and have the same risk factors that, that essentially increase their risk of being victimized. We do know that with trafficking, a significant portion of survivors have also experienced prior abuse or even childhood abuse, which increases their risk. And I believe it's 1 in 6 men have been victimized in the form of like sexual violence. And that's just the number that we know of.
So what you're saying is if I work in a community organization or in the hospital, I should always have in the back of my mind that perhaps this young boy or this man I'm working with could be a victim of human trafficking.
Of course, absolutely. Anybody can be a victim. And, and it's important also to point out when we first talked at the beginning of the webinar, recognizing that it's not just people who come from vulnerable communities and like low socioeconomic status that can be victimized. It can be people from privileged homes, living at home with supportive parents, but maybe they have other vulnerabilities like low self-esteem. Maybe they're being bullied at school. They're seeking that attention and approval from somebody, and the trafficker is the person that gave that to them, and that's how they get lured in.
Okay, so I'm hearing from you that anybody could be a victim, and we really need to be mindful of that. But can you tell me a little bit more about the ones coming from the marginalized communities that are victims of human trafficking?
For sure. We do see a huge overrepresentation in terms of individuals from marginalized communities. About 50% of the survivors that we see in Canada are First Nation. And if you compare that to the fact that only about 4% of the population in Canada is First Nation, that's a staggering statistic. I mean, a lot of that, we can look at the vulnerability factors and the risk factors, right? Like poverty, previous abuse, First Nations individuals, have the impact of colonialization, the residential school system. All of these things increase their vulnerability. There's also an overrepresentation of, communities where, people of color, the LGBTQ2+ community, and largely the same risk factors, right? Systemic discrimination and poverty and, prior abuse. These are all things that increase the risk, for sure. I think, we see a higher number of those populations with human trafficking for largely the same reason. We see higher numbers in the criminal justice system and the child welfare system.
So the key theme is vulnerability, right? Whether it's in a marginalized community or even in a, well-supported home, but being vulnerable. This is such a, it's such a hard topic to discuss. And I can't even imagine what you go through when you support these victims on a daily basis. Can you tell me what type of support that your organization, Victim Services offer to individuals that are at risk or are being trafficked?
For sure. So first I'll say when you said, what I go through, I want to point out that I get my strength from seeing the strength and resilience in these survivors. Like it is truly incredible what they can endure and they're still surviving. So that's largely, what kind of helps me to keep going in terms of this type of work. Victim Services, we provide very practical support. So immediate, safety planning, crisis intervention, linking with other community services. We do have access to some funding through the Ministry of the Attorney General. They provide funding. It's called VQRP, or the Victim Quick Response Program. And in certain cases where survivors are eligible, we can access funds for things like basic needs, shelter accommodation, residential drug treatment, trauma counseling, those kinds of things. We also do quite a bit of work in terms of working with our community partners, who are absolutely essential, because one agency alone can't do this work. The needs of survivors are so far reaching that it takes a wraparound approach to help. And so we do have, as you mentioned earlier, the Durham Region Human Trafficking Coalition. That's made up of a number of partnering agencies that we all come together to help collectively support. And I do think that, national and international efforts are required as well, which we are also involved in to some degree, to make sure that we're sharing resources and, knowledge of best practice and those sorts of things, because it is a global issue.
Mm-hmm. So not to put you on the spot, but you did mention the national and international efforts. Can you tell me a bit more about what's being done nationally, or even provincial wide? Can you please shed a bit more light?
For sure. So, so we're very lucky in Canada. We do have government support to try and combat this issue. So on the federal level, they did have the National Action Plan to Combat Human Trafficking, which I guess the formal aspect of that plan ended in 2016, but the financial commitment has not. So the federal government has committed, I believe it's $6 million annually. And then our provincial government in Ontario has contributed $307 million. And they also have an anti-trafficking strategy, which we're implementing between 2020 and 2025. Internationally, I think the United Nations takes the lead in terms of efforts to combat human trafficking. I couldn't probably comment in depth in terms of those efforts, but I know they do quite a bit of research and intervention, and particularly in countries where they lack legislation or they lack any type of supports and services for victims of human trafficking. It's actually the international organizations that go in to provide the support.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for just, bringing your expertise to our panel, to the panel today, the webinar today, and just shedding more light on this important topic of human trafficking to everybody, but to boys and men. I do appreciate that. And so what can we do as citizens or partner agencies to help in this fight?
Wow. I think awareness and education is absolutely essential. We're doing a lot of work. Victim Services has provided education to multiple service providers, hospitals, addictions treatment centers. We're going into the schools. We're trying to educate youth. We do parents and prevention nights, which you can probably access information for on our social media. So if you search Victim Services of Durham Region, I believe we're on Instagram, Facebook. You should be able to find the links to some of those education sessions. But I think that awareness and education is key, and also advocacy. We know that these marginalized groups are overrepresented, and so I think advocating for better supports and services that are more culturally appropriate and that target, the factors that make them increasingly vulnerable, I think is also huge.
Thank you. So I do believe having webinars like this, where you get to come and share your expertise with us on this subject matter, is very important. And perhaps if you could share the link that she was referring to with our guests today and on the Facebook page, so people that are interested in this topic can do further research or find better ways to support, that would be appreciated. Thank you so much, Krista, for taking your time once again to speak with us this morning. I really appreciate, just the breadth of knowledge that you have on this subject matter and your passion. And, as someone that has known you for some time now, this is such a wonderful, wonderful way to spend some time with you, because I haven't actually seen you physically in years. So thank you once again, Krista.
It's my pleasure. Before we end, I probably should point out that in Canada, we do have a national human trafficking hotline. as well. It's a toll-free number available 24/7. So if anybody requires support, or you know somebody who may be trafficked, you can always access that line as well.
Okay, so
sorry,
yes.
Tola, there's a question from Praveen.
Sorry. Okay, hold on. Let me check our chat. Okay. Krista, would you like me to read that question, or would you like to just read it yourself? It's in the chat.
Let's see.
I can just read it out loud. Okay,
Yeah.
So my name is Rashmi, social worker, and I work with children and youth mental health. We revive cases where children does involve trafficking. Some kids, they make money and this goes towards getting drugs. I would like to know how we can help the kids in order to prevent that. Also, some resources. I'm aware about Elizabeth Fry Society providing service. Is there any other resources? So I take it you are probably located in the GTA then, Rashmi.
Yeah, I work in GTA.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
So
there are a lot of resources which would take us well beyond this webinar for me to run through. I think the quick and easy answer is, you know, the victim services agencies are all across Ontario, we're all across Canada. And so anytime you're needing support or direction in terms of what are the resources for trafficking in my area, you can always call your local victim services and they will help navigate. They can provide you with a list of resources because there are a number of resources out there that you can access. I think with youth in particular, prevention is key. I mean, certainly we have supports and services that are aimed at intervening and supporting them to help them try and safely exit a trafficking situation. But again, like awareness and education to kind of, you know, prevent it from happening in the first place is obviously, you know, an important piece as well. But certainly reach out to your victim services agency and I know they would be happy to link you with a list of resources that you can access.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Krista. So is there any other questions we have that anybody else would like to discuss with us or bring up before we bring this program to an end?
Yeah. I'm just wondering, have you all ever worked with the private for-profit sector? I noticed that everybody that seems to care about social justice issues tends to go the agency route, the nonprofit route, governmental route, and I'm doing something completely different. I really think it would be powerful if for-profit companies felt free, and it would start with individuals like entrepreneurs like me. One person. I'm training people that are going to be entrepreneurs, that are online entrepreneurs that can speak freely about social justice issues and raise awareness, and get into politics and racial issues and issues like this. Have you ever engaged with anybody that's training up entrepreneurs that will be for-profit entrepreneurs that are solopreneurs that can speak freely about social justice issues like this?
Yes, I think one example that comes to mind is we are trying to educate landlords because we're seeing a lot of situations where particularly, you know, survivors are homeless and seeking accommodation. And so I think landlords are in a unique position to be able to identify some of the red flags. So that is one of our target goals over the next while, is to educate and train landlords. We also do training and education for hotel managers and hotel staff where they see a lot of these things happening. We work a lot with drug treatment programs in the private sector because we can access some of that support through our VQRP funding. And certainly we have a lot of support from our local MPs. A number of our MPs in Durham region have actually done ride-alongs with the police trafficking unit and are very, very supportive of the initiatives that we're working on. So yeah, I mean, quite honestly, we would be willing to work with anybody who's willing to listen and advocate and you know, promote awareness. Absolutely.
Great, I'm a landlord too, so yeah, I'd love to just kind of be aware of some of the outreach that you do just to see the business model.
sure.
Yeah, I'd really love to get in touch with you.
Thank you for bringing that up. It's an excellent point.
Thank you, Jason. I think that's actually really important that as a landlord, you're aware of maybe this could be occurring right under your nose, and then you would know what to do about it and how to address it so that if it is a victim residing in your place of residence, you would, tread very carefully, right? Whereas if it's the actual perpetrator, you would also know what to do. So thank you for bringing your question to light. And thank you, Krista, for shedding more light on what you guys do to work with private or for-profit individuals. Thank you. So I'm just going to wrap this up.
Sorry, I have 2 questions. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I was wondering about the healing process, when somebody going through that situation and then coming from, back to the normal or to the new life. About that, can you share some of these?
Absolutely. So I do think we need a lot more supports and services. The challenge with working with survivors of trafficking is that the struggles that they have are not, it's not a single struggle. Often they're dealing with, housing situation, lack of shelter, being unable to meet their basic needs. They may not have another source of income. There's mental health struggles, the impact of trauma that they've experienced, often addictions. One of the biggest struggles that we have is in terms of kind of where to start. There's sort of this vicious cycle around, they need acute mental health stabilization. But that is a challenge because our hospitals are, over capacity generally, or, don't have the ability to admit these people for the lengthy periods of time that they need to stabilize from a mental health perspective. And then of course, the typical healthcare lens is to treat the medical issues, but if it's a substance abuse issue, they want to refer them elsewhere. The drug treatment centers will not take somebody until they're stabilized from a mental health perspective. So it's that catch-22. And then the overarching struggle, which is housing. How do you work with somebody to get them clean from substances and stabilize their mental health when they're living on the street and their basic needs are not met? And so those are the kind of the huge barriers that we come up against. First stage housing is probably one of our biggest challenges. We do not have a lot of, or if in most areas, any at all, treatment centers or support centers where we can sort of look at this on a holistic level and treat all of those issues at once. We also need all the service providers and treatment centers that are working with individuals to operate from a trauma-informed lens. And so recognizing the impact of trauma, whether it be from their childhood or recent trauma, and how that impacts their ability to participate in programming and interventions at this point in their life.
Well, the other question is, thank you. I really appreciate that. That's a hard part. It's not easy to understand. Also, the process is a huge. It's not overnight, and it will take some time. The other question is, like, if you can share any, at least one case that you cannot really forget. Is it any severe case or anything that deeply affected in your heart? Do you have any other case?
I mean, quite honestly, they all do, right? I mean, like these are people, right? Like somebody's child, somebody's mother, somebody's sister, somebody's brother, so I mean, honestly, that each and every one of them impact me in some way, and I've learned a great deal from all of them. I think, working in the emergency department, when people come in there, you're not seeing them at their best even, right? They're coming in because they're in crisis, or they've just experienced a pretty brutal beating or that sort of thing. And so, I think it's just when you see somebody in such a vulnerable state, and then you can appreciate, the things that they've gone through, and that for many of these individuals, like, it stems from their, they've started experiencing these traumas right from childhood. It is heartbreaking. But you can also see the resilience in them. In terms of giving a specific case example. I think in an area like Durham, that might be a little challenging, just because I wouldn't want to say anything that could lead to somebody being identified. But I think I can give an example that sort of is common amongst a number of cases I've seen, and that's, the impact of trauma on an individual can cause them to regress developmentally. And so, I've worked with, young women or young men where, they might be 22 years old, but really when you start to dig a little deeper, you realize they're functioning at about like an 8-year-old level, which you don't always pick up on initially. But a lot of times, if they've been victimized since the age of 15, their development stops at 15. And so really, at the end of the day, they're functioning on a 15-year-old level, even though they may appear to be 25.
Tola, there are 2 questions before we end. So maybe you want to read it, Tola? Good, unmute.
Sorry.
Yes, your connection is okay?
Hello.
Mine is okay, but I can't hear Tolu.
Not that great right now. Hold on.
Tola, are you okay?
I keep getting- Hello.
I think the internet connection is low, that's why.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
No. Okay, hold on. Let me read the question though.
Is this better?
What do I contact to get in? What kind of awareness classes can be provided to students high school level?
So we are currently doing that. Our agency has committed to providing education and awareness for every grade 9 class in the Durham region. And so we're constantly providing those presentations. We also have a youth symposium that's coming up at the beginning of March, which will be a virtual and online thing. So you can find the information for that on Victim Services of Durham Region, our social media pages. I mean, it's important to acknowledge that the average age of recruitment is 13 years old. So, I mean, we can certainly see survivors from, from every spectrum, but the majority of them are between the ages of 18 and 25, with the average being 17. But they're recruiting as young as like 12 and 13. So educating our youth is huge. And that's part of why we committed to tackling the huge initiative of training all the grade 9 classes in Durham region.
Totally, there's another question. We can't hear you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Krista. There's another one. On behalf of Volunteer Heroes.
Sorry, Tola.
Hello?
I think we have some issues with the internet. Just hold on, okay? On behalf of Ontario Heroes, I would like to extend the regards.
I'm here.
Can you?
Excellent.
Extend the regards to a resource team. Also, Ontario Heroes looking forward to be partner in the awareness campaign for a good cause. Thanks again. Who do I contact to get invoice in awareness campaign? I mean, invoice involved. Sorry.
Sorry, how to get involved?
Yeah, involved in awareness campaign.
So is this somebody who's in the Durham region?
No, they are in the Peel region.
In Peel region, okay. I do know that, I know Toronto and I believe Peel as well both have coalitions established for anti-human trafficking strategies. And so, I mean, in Durham region, Victim Services chairs that group. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest with you, in terms of Peel region, who might chair that initiative. But certainly I would think that the Victim Services Appeal Region would be a great place to start.
All right, we can get some information. Probably I can share with Praveen, Rashmi later on.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, I think we lost Tolu because of connection. Tolu, are you there? How's your connection now? Can you talk? Can you talk?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Actually, we were supposed to be watching a friend of mine died, so I think my husband tried to log in, and so that's what happened with internet. It affected our usage. So sorry about that. Can you guys hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. I think there's a bit of a delay though, still.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so once again, I just want to thank everybody for attending today's webinar. Krista, you really just shed a lot of light and knowledge on this topic of human trafficking, especially in boys and men. And just, you know, I'm walking away with more information, and I will know what to look for even in my practice when it comes to working with boys and men. So thank you very much. And I believe people like Jason, I forgot what her name was, but the lady that asked about working with youth as well. And even the fact that we know that you guys are trying to reach starting as early as grade 9 to educate, so people know that this is, the risk is very real, and just touching on how vulnerable people are. So thank you very much once again, Krista. So I just want to just wrap up this webinar by just talking a little bit more about what we do at Voice of Men 360. We run a few live talk shows on a weekly basis. So we have Open Up, which takes place on Sundays at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then we also have in Tamil, a similar show on Wednesdays at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. We do have a panel discussion on the second Saturday of each month, and that's in the evenings from 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. once again Eastern Standard Time. On the fourth Saturday of every month, we also have a panel discussion in Tamil, same time, 7 to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then we started a show where we actually did it last Sunday. It was Moving On 2021, and that's on Sundays. I believe that's the third Sunday of every month. And so that's from 7 to 8 p.m. as well. We seem to like the 7 to 8 p.m. And then we are looking for volunteers to join our organization. We're also looking to work with professionals, community organizations, non-government organizations, social service workers, social workers, trainers, coaches, mentors, health professionals, and so on. So if you fit in any of those categories, or if in the category I didn't mention, but you are passionate about men's issues, please come and join us. And we also have our competition that has been running for some time now. We've been extending the deadline because we want as many people to enter. So it's a special art competition in collaboration with International Men's Day. And so it's a chance for you to share your feelings and emotions through arts. So drawing, painting, music, songs, short film, poem, articles, performance, fashion, comics, photography, and animation. So the prizes are, for first prize, you can get $250. Second prize is $175. Third prize is $100. And we are sponsored by a few different people: Right Choice Professionals, Wood Gold Barristers and Solicitors, Mac Home, and Agostino Mortgage, and then DF Credit Solutions. So there's a few rules for this competition. It must have English subtitles. Music, song, short film, animation, maximum 5 minutes. No age or gender limit to participate. So if you are children, just ask your parents if you can participate, and then enter. Okay, you must enter your name, your phone number, and your email address with your submission. And your picture. By entering into the competition, you agree that your picture and your creation will be shared on social media. And if it's group work, then you must submit all the participants' information along with your submission, so we know that everybody agreed for this competition. And then the judges' decisions are final, so you cannot bribe or appeal to us to change our mind about who wins. Okay, so for more information or to enter, you can email us at info@voiceofmen360.org. or you can contact us at 437-889-8329, or you can check us out on Facebook, www.facebook.com/voiceofmen360. Okay, so thank you everybody for joining us today. You can find on social media, on YouTube, you can subscribe to our channel, Voice of Men 360. And like I mentioned earlier, our Facebook group, Voice of Men 360. And we are also on Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Thank you very much for joining our webinar, and we hope to see you next time.
Yes, one more thing I just want to add. This is a huge, wider topic, so we cannot really close with a couple of questions. So we are planning to have a panel discussion probably next month though. So look for it, and we will share more details in the coming weeks. So all right, thanks a lot everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Krista. Thank you everybody.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.